Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones we see the least. For 27 years, Grace Washington had been the steady heartbeat of a house that never truly acknowledged her presence. She was there when baby Henry took his first steps, when Sarah cried through her first heartbreak, when Mr. Whitmore came home angry and Mrs. Whitmore retreated to her pills. Grace was always there. But in the summer of 1963, when 6-year-old Henry pressed a crumpled birthday invitation into her weathered hands, everything changed. His father was dying upstairs, and this little boy believed Grace could somehow make it better. She had spent her whole life caring for this family from the shadows. What happens when a woman who has given everything finally gets invited to step into the light? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Washington's day began at 5:30 in the morning, just as it had for 27 years. The old floorboards of her small room above the garage knew her footsteps by heart. The careful way she rose from bed, the soft shuffle to her dresser where she kept her worn Bible, leather-bound and filled with pressed flowers from the Whitmore garden. Between the pages of Psalms, dried magnolia petals marked her favorite verses, and in the margins she had written prayers in her careful script. Lord, bless Henry's cough. Help Sarah with her arithmetic. Give Mr. James peace in his heart. The morning of July 15th, 1963, felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the summer heat pressed against her window, or perhaps it was the weight of the small, hand-drawn invitation tucked beneath her Bible. Henry's crayon artwork, stick figures, holding hands around a lopsided cake, had kept her awake most of the night. Please come to my birthday, it read, in careful 6-year-old letters. Dad's sick, but he'll be happy. Grace smoothed her uniform and made her way across the dewy grass to the main house. The Whitmore mansion stood like a monument to old Southern pride, with its white columns and wraparound porch, its manicured gardens and iron gates. She had her own key, had for 15 years now, but she still entered through the back door. Some things never changed, even when trust grew deep as roots. The kitchen welcomed her with familiar warmth. This was her domain, where she had fed 3 generations of Whitmores, where she had bandaged scraped knees and listened to whispered secrets. The morning light filtered through yellow curtains she had sewn herself, casting everything in golden comfort. She started the coffee. Mr. James liked it strong, Mrs. Eleanor preferred it weak, and began preparing breakfast with the rhythm of someone who could do this work in her sleep. As bacon sizzled in the cast-iron pan, Grace's mind drifted back to her first day in this kitchen. She had been 35 then, a woman with her own dreams temporarily set aside. She had come to the Whitmores after her husband Thomas died in a mill accident, needing work that would keep food on her own table. Back on Cypress Street, Mrs. Eleanor was pregnant with Sarah then, and little James Jr. was barely walking. Grace, Mrs. Eleanor had said that first day, her voice tight with the exhaustion of managing a household and a grieving heart. Her own mother had passed just months before. I need someone who understands that children require more than just feeding and cleaning. They need someone who will love them. Love them. Grace had nodded, not knowing then how prophetic those words would become. She had come looking for employment and found herself raising children who would call her by name, but never claim her as family. She had watched them grow, celebrated their victories in quiet moments, worried over their troubles long into the night, and somehow, without meaning to, she had given them pieces of her soul. Sarah appeared in the doorway now, 15 and all, arms and legs, her blonde hair still mussed from sleep. "Morning, Grace," she said, settling at the small breakfast table where Grace had fed her countless meals over the years. "Morning, baby girl," Grace replied, plating eggs the way Sarah liked them, over easy with the tiniest sprinkle of paprika. "You're up early for summer vacation." Sarah accepted the plate with a grateful smile. "Couldn't sleep. Mama's been crying." Again. Her voice carried the weight of a young woman forced to grow up too fast. "Daddy had another bad night." Grace's hands stilled over the stove. James Whitmore's illness had been ravaging the family for 6 months now. "Cancer," the doctor said, though they whispered the word like a curse. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and social gatherings now spent his days in bed, his body, betraying the iron will that had built the Whitmore fortune. "Your daddy's a fighter," Grace said gently, though she had seen the truth in his eyes during her brief encounters bringing meal trays upstairs. James Whitmore was letting go, making peace with leaving his family behind. "Grace," Sarah's voice, was small, vulnerable. "Do you remember when I was little and I asked Mama why you couldn't eat dinner with us?" Grace's breath caught. She remembered that evening clearly. Sarah couldn't have been more than 7, sitting in the formal dining room, her small legs swinging from the chair. "I remember," Grace said carefully. "Mama said it was because you had your own family to go home to, but you never talked about them, and you were always here when I needed you." Sarah looked up, her blue eyes, so much like her father's, filled with questions that had been growing for years. "Did you ever have children of your own, Grace?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Grace had been asked this before, in different ways, and she had always deflected with gentle skill. But something in Sarah's voice, in the vulnerability of this moment, made her pause. "I had a chance once," Grace said quietly, turning back to the stove. "Your daddy offered me time off when you were babies, encouraged me to marry again. There was a good man, a deacon at my church named Samuel. But I looked at you and James Jr. and little Henry when he came along, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you all when you needed me most." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When Grace glanced back, she saw tears in the girl's eyes. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "Sorry for what, baby?" "That we kept you from having your own family." Grace crossed to the table and cupped Sarah's face in her weathered hands. "Child, don't you understand? You are my family, all of you. Have been for more years than I can count." The sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted them. Henry appeared in his pajamas, hair sticking up in all directions, his face bright with the joy that seemed to radiate from him no matter what storms gathered around the house. "Grace!" he called, launching himself into her arms with the complete trust of a child who had never known anything but love from this woman. "Did you see my invitation? I put it under your Bible so it would be extra special." Grace's heart clenched. "I saw it, sweetheart. It's beautiful. Are you coming? Please say you're coming. Mama says maybe you're too busy, but I told her you're never too busy for birthdays. Remember when you made me that train cake when I was 4? And you sang that song about the little engine?" Grace did remember. She remembered every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. She remembered being the one to comfort Henry through nightmares, to teach him to tie his shoes, to answer his endless questions about why the sky was blue and where butterflies went in winter. "Henry, honey," she began, but the words stuck in her throat. Mrs. Eleanor's voice drifted down from upstairs, calling for her morning tea. Grace had been bringing Eleanor Whitmore her breakfast in bed for 15 years, ever since the woman's second miscarriage had left her fragile and dependent on small rituals of comfort. "Go on upstairs," Sarah said softly. "I'll watch Henry." Grace climbed the grand staircase, her feet silent on the Persian runner that she vacuumed twice weekly. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Whitmores in formal poses, their eyes following her ascent. She had dusted these frames countless times, but had never appeared in any of the photographs, as if her 27 years of devotion existed in the spaces between the family's documented history. Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom was dim, heavy curtains, drawn against the morning light. The woman lay small and pale against her pillows, her once golden hair now streaked with silver, her face bearing the lines of worry and medication. "Grace," she said, her voice thread-thin, "thank you for the tea. Could you sit with me for a moment?" Grace perched on the edge of the chair beside the bed, the same chair where she had spent countless hours during Eleanor's difficult pregnancies. Her bouts with depression, the long nights when James Jr. had pneumonia and Sarah had colic. I heard Henry talking about his birthday invitation, Eleanor said, not meeting Grace's eyes. I'm not sure it's appropriate, given the circumstances. The words hung between them like a wall. Appropriate. Grace had lived her entire adult life within the boundaries of what was appropriate, what was expected, what was proper for a black woman in service to a white family in Montgomery, Alabama. Mrs. Eleanor, Grace said carefully, Henry's just a child. He doesn't understand. Doesn't understand what? Eleanor's voice carried a sharpness that spoke to deeper fears. That there are rules, that there are ways things are done. Grace, you know how much we depend on you, how much you mean to this family. But a birthday party with guests, with James so ill, Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the careful composure she had maintained for decades. What are you afraid of, Mrs. Eleanor? The question surprised them both. Eleanor's eyes widened, and for a moment Grace saw not the privileged woman who commanded her days, but a frightened mother facing the loss of her husband and the judgment of her social circle. I'm afraid, Eleanor whispered, that people will. Don't think we don't know our place, either of us. Grace nodded slowly. She understood. In 1963, Montgomery, the world was changing, but slowly, painfully. The bus boycott was nearly a decade past, but the scars remained. Integration was the law, but hearts and minds moved at their own pace. A black woman at a white child's birthday party, even a woman who had raised that child, would raise eyebrows, prompt whispers, create complications neither family could afford. I understand, Grace said, standing to leave. Grace, wait. Eleanor's voice was soft now, vulnerable. When Henry was born, when I was so sick afterward, you were the one who walked the floors with him. You were the one who knew he liked to be rocked in the clockwise direction, who figured out that Mozart helped him sleep. You saved my sanity during those first months. Grace paused at the door. And when Sarah broke her arm, falling from the oak tree, you were the one who stayed calm, who held her in the car while James drove to the hospital. You sang to her the whole way. Grace's throat tightened. And James Jr., when he was struggling with his studies, when James was so hard on him, you were the one who found the patience to sit with him every evening, helping him with mathematics until it finally made sense. Eleanor was crying now. Quiet tears that spoke to years of unspoken gratitude and unnamed grief. What I'm trying to say is, Eleanor continued, maybe appropriate isn't the same thing as right. Maybe Henry understands something the rest of us have forgotten. Grace turned back to face her employer, her friend, this complicated woman who had shared her children and her trust, but never her table. Are you saying I should come to the party? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded over the embroidered coverlet. I'm saying that Henry loves you, and love, true love, doesn't understand boundaries the way we think it should. Grace felt the weight of 27 years in that moment. The careful steps, the unspoken rules, the love given and received in measured doses. She thought of the invitation tucked beneath her Bible, of Henry's bright eyes and innocent heart, of the man upstairs who was running out of time to make peace with his life. I'll think about it, Grace said finally. As she made her way back downstairs, she could hear Henry's laughter drifting from the kitchen, mixing with Sarah's gentle voice, as she helped him practice writing thank-you notes for gifts he had not yet received. The sound filled the grand house with the kind of joy that money could not buy, the kind of warmth that came from hearts that knew how to love without conditions. Grace paused at the landing, looking out the tall window at the gardens she had tended in her spare time, at the oak tree where she had pushed 3 children on swings, at the porch where she had served countless glasses of sweet tea to guests who barely acknowledged her presence. Tomorrow was Henry's 7th birthday, and, For the first time in 27 years, Grace Washington was being invited to step out of the shadows and into the light. That evening, Grace sat on her narrow bed above the garage, holding Henry's invitation in hands that had scrubbed floors, kneaded bread, and wiped away tears for more years than she cared to count. The crayon drawings seemed to glow in the lamplight. Stick, figures with oversized smiles, a birthday cake that looked more like a rainbow than anything edible, and at the bottom, Henry's careful printing. Grace Washington, you are invited. Her sister Lily would think she had lost her mind. Grace reached for the black telephone on her nightstand, its cord stretched tight from years of late-night conversations with the woman who had been her anchor through every storm. Lily lived just across town in the quarters, but it might as well have been another world. Where Grace spent her days in the grand Whitmore mansion, Lily cleaned offices downtown, her work invisible, but her evenings her own. Lord have mercy. Lily's voice crackled through the line after Grace explained about the invitation. Child, what are you thinking? I'm thinking about a little boy who's about to lose his daddy, Grace said quietly. I'm thinking about a grown woman who's about to lose her job, Lily shot back. Grace, honey, you know I love those children like they were my own nieces and nephews, but this isn't our world. You go to that party and every white family in Montgomery's going to be talking about the Whitmores not knowing how to handle their help. Grace flinched at the word, though she knew Lily meant no harm. Help. That's what she was, wasn't she? For all the love, all the years, all the pieces of herself she had given to the Whitmore children, she was still just help. Henry doesn't see it that way, Grace said. Henry's 6 years old, Grace. He doesn't see a lot of things the way they really are. Grace held the invitation closer to the light, studying the careful way Henry had drawn her face. 2 dots for eyes, a curved line. For her smile, hair represented by brown scribbles. In his drawing, she stood right next to the family, same size as everyone else, smiling the same smile. What if that's the problem? Grace asked. What if the way we see things isn't the way they should be? Lily was quiet for a long moment. When? She spoke again, her voice was gentler. Grace, baby, I know that family means the world to you, but you can't change 100 years of how things are done just by showing up to a birthday party. Maybe not, Grace admitted, but what if I can change something for Henry? What if, just for one day, he doesn't have to learn that the woman who raised him isn't good enough to celebrate with him? And what about after that day? What about when he grows up and realizes the world isn't as kind as his birthday party? What about when you're too old to work and they don't need you anymore? The questions hit Grace like stones, each one finding a tender place she had tried not to examine too closely. She was 62 years old, her back ached in the mornings, her feet swelled by evening. She had saved some money over the years, but not enough to retire comfortably. The Whitmores had been generous with her salary, but she was still dependent on their goodwill for her security. I have to think about it, Grace said finally. You think all you want, Lily replied, but you remember that pride is expensive, and some bills take more than money to pay. After hanging up, Grace sat in the growing darkness of her small room. Through her window, she could see the lights of the main house, warm and golden against the summer evening. Sarah's room glowed with the blue light of her television. She was allowed to watch American Bandstand on Saturday nights. Henry's room was dark. He had been asleep since 8 o'clock, exhausted by the excitement of anticipating his birthday. Grace knew the rhythm of the house as intimately as her own heartbeat. Mrs. Eleanor would be giving Mr. James his evening medication now, helping him sip water through a straw because swallowing had become difficult. By 9 o'clock, she would retreat to her own room with a glass of sherry and her romance novels. Sarah would turn off her television by 9:30, though she would read under her covers with a flashlight until nearly midnight. The house would settle into silence, but Grace would lie awake listening to the sounds of the family she had helped to raise, knowing their dreams and fears as if they were her own. She opened her Bible to Psalms, where a pressed magnolia petal marked her favorite. Verse, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." The words had carried her through Thomas's death, through the lonely years that followed, through watching other women her age marry again, while she chose to pour her maternal instincts into children who would never call her mother. But what if joy wasn't just something that came with mourning? What if it was something you had to choose, something you had to be brave enough to claim? Grace thought about the years of birthday parties she had prepared but never attended. She had baked countless cakes, decorated countless rooms, wrapped countless presents. She had watched from the kitchen window as children laughed and played games, as parents made speeches and took photographs. She had been essential to every celebration, but never included in any. Henry's invitation represented something different. This wasn't a polite acknowledgement of her service, or a token gesture of appreciation. This was a child who genuinely wanted the woman who had raised him to share in his joy. In his 6-year-old world, love was invitation enough. The next morning brought a house full of nervous energy. Henry bounced around the kitchen like a pinball, checking and rechecking the list of friends coming to his party. Sarah helped Grace prepare finger sandwiches and punch, while Mrs. Eleanor fluttered between the party preparations and her husband's bedside. "Grace," Henry said for the dozenth time, "you're still coming, right? You promised you'd think about it, and thinking time is over because the party's today." Grace knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that held no prejudice, no understanding of social boundaries, only love and hope. "Henry, baby, there might be some grown-ups at your party who don't understand why I'm there." Henry's face scrunched in confusion. "Why wouldn't they understand? You're part of our family." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Part of our family. Henry said it with such simple certainty, as if it were an obvious fact that everyone should recognize. "Some people have different ideas about families," Grace said carefully. "Well, their ideas are wrong," Henry declared with the absolute confidence of childhood. "You love us, and we love you. That makes you family." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. Out of the mouths of babes came wisdom that adults spent lifetimes trying to understand. "Besides," Henry continued, "Daddy wants you to come. He told me so this morning when I went to say good morning. He said, you've been taking care of all of us for so long that you deserve cake and ice cream too." Grace's breath caught. James Whitmore, the man who had rarely acknowledged her presence beyond the courteous nods of an employer, had told his son that she deserved to celebrate with them. "He really said that?" Henry nodded vigorously. "He said a lot of things. He said, you're one of the best people he's ever known, and that I should always remember to be grateful for people who love you, even when they don't have to." Grace stood slowly, her decision crystallizing like sugar in cooling syrup. She looked around the kitchen that had been her domain for 27 years, at the children she had raised, at the home she had tended with devotion that went far, beyond duty. "Henry," she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve, "I would be honored to come to your birthday party." Henry's whoop of joy could probably be heard 3 houses down. He threw his arms around Grace's waist and squeezed with all his might, as if he could hold her to her promise through pure physical force. "This is going to be the best birthday ever," he declared. Grace smiled, though her heart hammered with nervousness. She had just agreed to step across a line that had defined her entire adult life. In a few hours she would sit at a table as a guest instead of serving from the shadows. She would be photographed, included, acknowledged. She would, finally, after 27 years, find out what it felt like to be family instead of just help. Grace spent the morning hours preparing for the party with the meticulous care of someone who understood that details mattered, especially when those details might be scrutinized by guests who had never seen her as anything more than efficient. Hands that kept the Whitmore household running smoothly. She pressed her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, modest but well-tailored, purchased 3 years ago for church and worn only on the most special occasions. She polished her good shoes and pinned her hair in the neat bun that had been her signature style for decades. Looking in the mirror above her dresser, She saw a woman who had aged with dignity, whose face bore the lines of someone who had laughed with children and worried over their troubles, who had found meaning in service but had rarely considered her own worth. Today felt different. Today, she was not just Grace, the housekeeper. She was Grace, the invited guest. The irony was not lost on her that she had spent the morning preparing Henry's favorite German chocolate cake, the same cake she had made for his birthday every year since he was old enough to have preferences. Her hands knew the recipe by heart, the perfect balance of sweet chocolate and coconut, the delicate layering that required patience and skill. But this year, instead of watching the celebration from the kitchen window, she would sit at the table. When the cake was served, around noon, she made her way to the main house to check on the final preparations. The dining room had been transformed with balloons and streamers in Henry's favorite colors, red and blue, like his beloved Superman cape. Sarah had helped arrange the gifts on the side table, and Mrs. Eleanor had brought out the good china, the same plates that had been used for Christmas dinners and important dinner parties. "Grace!" Mrs. Eleanor said, appearing in the doorway with a nervous energy that reminded Grace of a bird ready to take flight. "I wanted to speak with you before the guests arrive." Grace turned from where she was adjusting the balloon arrangement. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor glanced around, as if making sure they were alone. "I know this is unusual, what we're doing today. If anyone says anything inappropriate—" "Mrs. Eleanor," Grace interrupted gently, "I've been dealing with inappropriate comments my whole life. I think I can manage a children's birthday party." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Of course. I just want you to know that you belong here. Henry wants you here, and that's what matters." The words were kind, but Grace heard the underlying tension. Eleanor was nervous about the social implications, about what the other parents would think, about whether this gesture of inclusion would be seen as progressive enlightenment or dangerous boundary crossing. Grace's mind drifted to a memory from 15 years earlier. Henry's older brother, James Jr., had been in kindergarten then, and Grace had been the one to drive him to school each morning because Mrs. Eleanor was struggling with what the doctor quietly called nervous exhaustion, a polite term for the depression that had settled over her after her third miscarriage. One morning, little James Jr. had looked up at Grace with his serious 5-year-old eyes and asked, "Why don't you come to the school programs, Grace? All the other mamas come." Grace had explained gently that she wasn't his mama, that she was someone who helped take care of him, but that his real mama loved him very much. "But you love me too," James Jr. had insisted. "I can tell, so why can't you be my mama too? Jimmy Henderson has 2 daddies since his mama married Mr. Peterson." The innocence of the question had stayed with Grace for years. Children understood love in ways that adults had forgotten. Simple, direct, uncomplicated by social rules and historical prejudices. Now, as she put the finishing touches on Henry's party preparations, she wondered what would have happened if she had been braver then, if she had challenged the boundaries that kept love confined to acceptable categories. The sound of car doors slamming announced the arrival of the first guests. Through the front window, Grace watched as Henry's classmates tumbled out of station wagons, their parents following with the careful politeness of people fulfilling social obligations. She recognized most of them from school events she had attended. As Henry's caregiver, PTA meetings, where she sat in the back row, Christmas programs where she applauded from the shadows. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her twin boys, her perfectly coiffed hair and coordinated outfit speaking to the kind of leisure that came from having full-time help. Behind her came Mr. and Mrs. Davidson with their daughter, Lucy, Henry's closest friend from school. Grace had packed countless lunches for playdates between Henry and Lucy, had bandaged skinned knees and refereed disputes over toys. Henry raced to greet each arrival with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child whose birthday represented the center of the universe. Grace watched from the kitchen as he hugged his friends, chatted excitedly about the games they would play, and made sure everyone knew that his cake was made special by Grace, the best cake maker in the whole world. The casual way Henry claimed her as part of his celebration struck Grace as both beautiful and terrifying. He had no understanding of the courage it would take for her to walk into that room, to sit among parents who had never seen her as anything more than efficient service. Sarah appeared at Grace's elbow, beautiful in her summer dress, growing into the kind of young woman who would turn heads wherever she went. "Are you nervous?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," Grace admitted. Sarah smiled. "Good. That means it matters." At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Eleanor called everyone to gather in the dining room. Grace heard the chatter and laughter of children mixing with the polite conversation of adults, the clink of good china, and the rustle of party dresses. Her moment had arrived. She smoothed her dress one final time, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the sound of celebration. As she appeared in the doorway, the adult conversation faltered slightly, a barely perceptible shift in energy that spoke to surprise and uncertainty. But Henry's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Grace!" he called out, as if her arrival was the most natural thing in the world. "Come sit by me. I saved you the best seat." And there at the head of the table was an empty chair with a place card written in Henry's careful handwriting, "Grace Washington, family." Grace felt every pair of adult eyes in the room, watching her as she made her way to the chair Henry had prepared. Some expressions held curiosity, others showed polite confusion, and a few revealed the kind of discomfort that came from witnessing familiar boundaries being crossed. But as Grace took her seat at the table instead of serving from beside it, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in 27 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The birthday party unfolded with the orchestrated chaos that only children could create. Henry opened his presents with gleeful enthusiasm, each gift prompting squeals of delight and immediate demonstrations for his friends. A set of Lincoln logs from the Pattersons sparked plans for elaborate constructions. A chemistry set from the Davidsons, perhaps a bit advanced for a 7-year-old, was proclaimed the coolest thing ever, and would undoubtedly cause Mrs. Eleanor considerable worry in the coming weeks. Grace sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching the celebration with the complicated emotions of someone experiencing a familiar event from an entirely new perspective. She had organized dozens of children's parties over the years, had cleaned up the aftermath of countless celebrations, but she had never before been a participant in the joy rather than just its facilitator. The other parents treated her with the careful politeness reserved for situations that didn't fit established social patterns. Mrs. Patterson inquired about her health with the kind of strained courtesy that suggested she was working from a script she had never needed before. Mr. Davidson nodded in her direction occasionally, clearly uncertain whether to engage her in conversation or maintain the comfortable distance that had always defined their previous interactions. But Sarah Whitmore, 15 and fierce in the way that only teenage girls could be, seemed determined to bridge any uncomfortable gaps in conversation. "Grace taught me to make cornbread when I was 12, Sarah announced to the table during a lull in the children's excitement. "Mama kept burning it, but Grace showed me the secret is buttermilk and a cast-iron skillet that's been seasoned just right." Mrs. Patterson smiled tightly. "How nice that you've learned some domestic skills." "She taught me a lot more than cooking," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the subtle challenge of a young woman who had inherited her father's directness. "Grace helped me with algebra when I was struggling last year. She's better at mathematics than most of the teachers at Montgomery Academy." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. Sarah was deliberately claiming her, publicly acknowledging her importance in ways that went beyond household management. The girl was taking a stand, though she probably didn't fully understand the courage it required. Lucy Davidson, Henry's best friend, piped up from across the table. "Henry told me Grace knows every bird in Alabama and can make their sounds. Show them, Grace." Henry's eyes lit up with excitement. "Yes, do the mockingbird! Do the mockingbird!" Grace felt every adult eye in the room focus on her with varying degrees of curiosity and discomfort. For a moment, she considered demurring, maintaining the quiet dignity that had been her shield for so many years. But then she looked at Henry's eager face, at Lucy's expectant expression, at Sarah's encouraging smile, and she made a choice that surprised even herself. She cupped her hands around her mouth and produced the liquid, cascading song of a mockingbird, a perfect imitation that she had learned as a child from her own grandfather. The sound filled the dining room, wild and beautiful, and completely unexpected from the quiet woman who had served their meals and managed their household for decades. The children clapped with delight, but it was the expressions on the adults' faces that stayed with Grace. Surprise, certainly, but also a kind of recognition, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time, not just as efficient hands and a reliable presence, but as a person with talents and knowledge and a rich inner life that extended far beyond their household. "That's remarkable," Mr. Davidson said, and his admiration seemed genuine. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My grandfather taught me," Grace replied. "He said every creature has its own song, and if you listen carefully enough, you can learn to sing along." The conversation that followed was different somehow, more relaxed, more genuine. Mrs. Patterson asked about Grace's knowledge of local wildlife, and soon they were discussing the migration patterns of hummingbirds and the best flowers for attracting butterflies to the garden. Mr. Davidson, it turned out, was an amateur ornithologist who had been struggling to identify a bird he had spotted near his office building. Henry basked in the attention being paid to Grace, as if her success reflected his own good judgment in recognizing her worth. He kept one hand on her arm throughout the conversations, a possessive little gesture that declared his claim to her attention and affection. When it came time to serve the cake, Mrs. Eleanor moved to rise from her chair, but Grace instinctively started to stand as well, 27 years of muscle memory almost overriding her new role as guest. "Mama can get the cake," Sarah said firmly, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're not working today, Grace. You're celebrating." The distinction felt monumental. Grace settled back into her chair, watching Mrs. Eleanor carry the German chocolate cake she had made with such care. When Henry blew out his 7 candles, making a wish he whispered was for Daddy to feel better and for Grace to always be part of our family. Grace felt tears threatening to spill over. As the cake was served, she tasted her own creation while seated at the table where it was being enjoyed, and somehow it tasted different, richer, more satisfying, as if the context of consumption had changed its very essence. The afternoon wore on with games of musical chairs and pin the tail on the donkey, activities that Grace had supervised countless times but never participated in. When Henry insisted she join the musical chairs competition, she found herself laughing, as she scrambled for seats alongside parents who had never heard her voice raised in anything but quiet conversation. She was eliminated in the 3rd round, much to Henry's dramatic dismay, but the experience of playing rather than organizing left her feeling lighter than she had in years. As the party began to wind down and parents started gathering their tired, sugar-crashed children, Mrs. Patterson approached Grace with something that looked like genuine warmth in her expression. "Grace," she said, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you're wonderful with children. Have you ever considered teaching? My sister works for the school district, and they're always looking for people who understand children the way you do." The suggestion caught Grace off guard. Teaching had been a dream she had set aside so long ago that she had almost forgotten it existed. Before Thomas died, before she needed immediate employment, before she became essential to the Whitmore household, she had imagined herself in a classroom, shaping young minds, making a difference in ways that extended beyond any single family. That's very kind of you to say," Grace managed. "I'm serious," Mrs. Patterson continued. "The way you handled that little crisis with Tommy spilling punch on his shirt, the way you got all the children to listen during the games, You have a gift." Grace glanced over at Henry, who was showing his new Lincoln logs to his father through the French doors that opened onto the porch. James Whitmore had made the effort to come downstairs for a few minutes of his son's party, and though he was clearly exhausted, his face showed genuine pleasure at Henry's excitement. "Thank you," Grace said to Mrs. Patterson. "I'll think about it." But even as she spoke the polite words, Grace's mind was spinning. For 27 years, she had defined herself in relation to the Whitmore family's needs. She had been indispensable, irreplaceable, essential, but always in service to someone else's life. The idea that her skills might translate to a broader world, that her talents might be valued in their own right, felt both thrilling and terrifying. As the last guests departed and the house settled into the quiet aftermath of celebration, Grace found herself alone in the kitchen with the party dishes, falling back into familiar patterns despite the day's revelations. But Sarah appeared at her elbow, dish towel in hand. "I told you," Sarah said, beginning to dry the plates Grace was washing. "You're not working today." "Old habits," Grace said with a smile. "Maybe it's time for some new habits," Sarah replied, her young voice carrying surprising wisdom. "Today was different, wasn't it? Good, different." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The day had been different, profound in ways she was still processing. She had been seen, acknowledged, valued not just for her service, but for herself. The parents, who had barely noticed her existence, had discovered she was a person with knowledge, talents, and opinions worth hearing. Most importantly, she had experienced what it felt like to be family instead of just help, to be included, rather than essential, to be valued for who she was, rather than what she did. As she hung up the dish towel and prepared to return to her room above the garage, Henry appeared in the doorway, still in his party clothes, but with chocolate frosting somehow smeared on his cheek. "Grace," he said, his voice serious in the way that only children could manage, "today was the best birthday ever." "I'm glad, sweetheart." "And you know why it was the best?" Grace knelt down to his level, using her thumb to wipe the frosting from his cheek. "Why?" "Because you were there, really there. Not just making things work from the kitchen. You were part of it." Grace felt her heart swell with an emotion too complex for words. "Thank you for inviting me, Henry. Thank you for wanting me there." Henry wrapped his arms around her neck in the fierce hug of a child who loved without reservation or condition. "You'll always be part of our family, Grace. Always." As Grace made her way across the darkening garden to her small room, she carried with her the echo of laughter, the taste of cake eaten at a table where she belonged, and the revolutionary idea that perhaps, after 27 years of living her life in service to others, it might finally be time to consider what she wanted for herself. The days following Henry's birthday party carried a different energy through the Whitmore household. Grace noticed it in small ways. The way Mrs. Eleanor asked her opinion about Henry's summer reading list, instead of simply assigning tasks. The way Sarah lingered in the kitchen for conversations that went beyond meal planning. The way even James Jr., home from his first year at Auburn University, seemed to see her with new eyes. But it was during her evening visits to Mr. Whitmore's bedside that Grace felt the most significant shift. For weeks, she had been bringing his dinner tray upstairs, helping him with medications when Mrs. Eleanor was overwhelmed, sitting quietly while he dozed. Their interactions had been polite but distant, the careful courtesy between employer and employee, even in the intimate setting of illness. 3 days after the party, as Grace arranged his evening medications beside a glass of water, James Whitmore spoke her name with a clarity that had been absent for weeks. "Grace," he said, his voice thin but determined, "sit with me for a moment." Grace settled into the bedside chair, the same chair where she had kept vigil during his worst nights, when sleep eluded him and pain made rest impossible. "I heard about Henry's party," he said. "Eleanor told me you sat at the table with the other parents." Grace nodded, uncertain where this conversation might lead. "Good," he said firmly. "It's about time." The words surprised her. James Whitmore had always been a man of few words, especially where household staff was concerned. His approval had typically been expressed through continued employment and occasional small bonuses at Christmas. "I need to tell you something," he continued, his blue eyes, so much like Henry's, focusing on her with an intensity that reminded her of the businessman he had been before illness claimed his strength. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, lying here with nothing but time and regret for company." Grace waited, sensing that this conversation had been building towards something important. 27 years ago, when you came to work for us, I thought I was hiring household help. Someone to cook and clean and manage the children when Eleanor couldn't." He paused, gathering strength. "I was wrong." Grace felt her breath catch. "You weren't just help, Grace. You are the heart of this family. You raised my children. When I was too busy building a business to notice they needed raising, you held this house together when Eleanor was struggling with her health. You gave love where I only knew how to give rules." James reached for the bedside drawer with trembling fingers. Inside was a small, worn photograph that Grace recognized immediately. It was a picture of Henry as a toddler, taken during his second birthday party. But this wasn't one of the formal portraits that filled the family albums. This was a candid shot that captured a moment Grace had forgotten. Henry had fallen and scraped his knee during the celebration, and Grace was kneeling beside him, holding him close while he cried into her shoulder. "I took this picture," James said softly. "I was watching from the doorway, and I saw the way you comforted him, the way you made his pain go away just by being there. That's when I realized what you really were to us." Grace stared at the photograph, remembering that day, remembering the way Henry had sought her out for comfort, even with his parents nearby. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment, his breathing labored with the effort of speaking. "Because I'm dying, Grace. And when a man is dying, he sees things clearly that he might have missed when he thought he had all the time in the world." The blunt acknowledgement of his condition hung between them like a bridge across 27 years of careful professional distance. "I see that I've been ungrateful," he continued. "Not just ungrateful, blind. You've loved my children as if they were your own. You've sacrificed your own chances at motherhood to mother mine. You've given us the best years of your life, and I never properly thanked you for it." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Mr. James, let me finish," he said gently. "Please." She nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "I know the world sees you as our employee. I know society has rules about where people like you and people like us fit in each other's lives, but in here," he placed a hand over his heart, "in the only place that really matters, your family. You always have been." The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not help, not staff, not even friend. Family. "Henry was right to invite you to his party," James continued. "Sarah was right to defend your place at our table. And I was wrong to take so long to see what they understood instinctively." Grace found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I love those children like they were my own. I know you do. And they love you the same way." James's smile was tired but genuine. "Henry talks about you the way other children talk about their mothers. Sarah seeks your advice, the way daughters turn to the women who raised them. Even James Jr., stubborn as he is, lights up when he talks about the woman who taught him to throw a proper curveball and helped him with his homework when I was too impatient to sit still." Grace thought about all the moments James was describing, the countless small acts of love and care that had accumulated over the years like deposits in a bank account she had never expected to cash. "What I'm trying to say," James continued, "is thank you. Thank you for loving us when we didn't deserve it. Thank you for staying when you could have found easier work elsewhere. Thank you for being the mother my children needed when I was too proud and Eleanor was too fragile to give them everything they required." Grace reached for his hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. For 27 years, she had maintained Careful physical boundaries, understanding that touch between employer and employee carried complicated implications. But tonight, as this dying man attempted to bridge decades of unspoken gratitude, such rules seemed meaningless. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "Those children, your children. They saved me as much as I might have helped them. After Thomas died, I was lost. This family gave me purpose, gave me a reason to get up every morning, gave me people to love when I thought that part of my life was over." James squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. "Grace, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that when I'm gone, you won't disappear. Promise me you'll stay part of this family, not because you work for us, but because you belong to us, and we belong to you." Grace felt the weight of 27 years settling around her like a comfortable blanket. She thought of Henry's invitation, of Sarah's fierce loyalty, of Mrs. Eleanor's nervous acceptance, of all the moments that had led to this one. "I promise," she said. Outside the window, evening was settling over Montgomery, and in the distance she could hear Henry's laughter drifting up from the garden where he was catching fireflies with Sarah. The sound of their joy mixed with the quiet seriousness of this bedside conversation, creating a harmony that spoke to the complex beauty of love that transcended social boundaries. The conversation with Mr. Whitmore marked a turning point that rippled through the household like stones dropped in still water. Grace found herself existing in a space she had never occupied before, acknowledged as family but still carrying the practical responsibilities that had defined her role for decades. It was a delicate balance, requiring both her own adjustment and the family's collective willingness to navigate uncharted territory. Mrs. Eleanor seemed the most uncertain about how to manage this new dynamic. 2 weeks after Henry's party, she appeared in the kitchen while Grace was preparing lunch, holding a recipe card in her trembling hands. "Grace," she said hesitantly, "I found this in my mother's recipe box. It's for cornbread dressing. The kind she used to make for Thanksgiving. I thought perhaps you might want to try it this year." Grace looked at the yellowed card, written in the careful script of a woman she had never met, but whose legacy lived on, in the family traditions she had helped to maintain. "Mrs. Eleanor," Grace said gently, "I've been making your cornbread dressing for 15 years. This recipe, it's almost exactly what I've been doing." Eleanor's face flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, of course you have. I should have realized. The only difference," Grace continued, studying the card more carefully, "is she added sage. I've been using thyme. Sage might be nicer." The relief in Eleanor's expression was palpable. "Mama always said the sage made all the difference. She grew it in her herb garden behind the kitchen." Grace smiled. "Then we should plant some sage. Henry would love to help with a herb garden." It was a small moment, but Grace recognized its significance. Eleanor was trying, in her own complicated way, to bridge the gap between acknowledging Grace as family, while still respecting the knowledge and expertise that Grace had developed through years of caring for this household. The recipe card was an offering, a piece of family history shared not with an employee, but with someone trusted to carry on traditions. That afternoon, as Grace helped Henry plant sage seedlings in the garden behind the kitchen, she thought about the intricate dance of relationships that was slowly reshaping itself around her new status in the household. Sarah had become her strongest advocate, often seeking her out for conversations that went far beyond household matters. The girl was planning for college. She wanted to study education, inspired partly by watching Grace's natural teaching ability with Henry. "Grace," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch shelling peas for dinner, "do you ever regret not having children of your own?" The question was direct in the way that only teenagers could manage, cutting straight to the heart of things that adults usually approach sideways. Grace considered her answer carefully. "I used to think I did," she said finally. "When I first came to work here, watching your mama with you babies, I felt like I was missing something essential. But over the years, I've come to understand that there are different ways of being a mother What do you mean? I mean that love doesn't follow the rules we think it does. I may not have given birth to any of you, but I've loved you through chicken pox and nightmares and first days of school. I've worried about your grades and celebrated your accomplishments and disciplined you when you needed it. If that's not motherhood, then I don't know what is. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hands still working automatically at the peas. Sometimes I think you know me better than Mama does. Grace felt a familiar pang of guilt, the complex emotion that came from loving someone else's children so deeply that the boundaries became blurred. Your Mama loves you very much, Grace said carefully. She just shows it differently than I do. I know. But Grace, when I go to college next year, when I become a teacher, when I have children of my own someday, I'm going to remember everything you taught me about patience and kindness and how to make people feel valued. You've been more than our housekeeper. You've been our example. The words hit Grace with unexpected force. She had spent so many years focused on the immediate needs of daily care, meals and cleaning and homework supervision, that she had not fully considered the deeper influence she might be having on these children's character development. That evening, as she sat in her room above the garage, Grace pulled out a small notebook she had kept hidden in her dresser drawer for years. In it, she had recorded moments of joy and concern from her time with the Whitmore family. Henry's first words, Sarah's struggles with mathematics, James Jr.'s triumph when he finally learned to ride his bicycle without training wheels. She had never expected anyone else to read these private observations, but now she wondered if they might represent something more valuable than personal memories. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. James Jr. had driven down from Auburn for the weekend, bringing with him his roommate, a young man named David, whose easy manner and genuine kindness had quickly endeared him to the family. Grace had prepared lunch for the boys, and as she served their sandwiches, she overheard their conversation about summer jobs. "My mom keeps suggesting I work at Daddy's bank," James Jr. was saying, "but honestly, I'd rather do something that feels more meaningful." "What kind of meaningful?" David asked. James Jr. glanced toward Grace, then back to his friend. "This is going to sound strange, but growing up, the person who taught me the most about character and integrity wasn't someone from my parents' social circle. It was Grace." Grace nearly dropped the pitcher of sweet tea she was carrying. "She never preached at us," James Jr. continued, "never sat us down for formal lessons about right and wrong. But she showed us, every single day, what it looked like to care about other people, to work with dignity, to find joy in simple things. When I was 12 and broke Mrs. Henderson's window playing baseball, Grace was the one who helped me figure out how to take responsibility and make amends. She taught me that mistakes don't define you, but how you handle them does." David nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like she made quite an impact." "She did. On all of us, though it took us too long to recognize it." James Jr. looked directly at Grace. "I've been thinking a lot since Henry's party about the kind of man I want to become, and I realize that most of what I admire about myself, Grace, untaught me." Grace felt tears threatening, but also a profound sense of validation. For years, she had worried that her influence on these children was too informal, too indirect. She had never had the authority to shape their values in obvious ways. That was the province of parents and teachers and ministers. But now she was beginning to understand that influence could be quiet and still be profound, that teaching could happen through example as much as through instruction. That night, as she updated her notebook with the day's observations, Grace wrote something she had never recorded before. "Today, I realized that the love I've poured into this family hasn't disappeared. It's become part of who they are. Maybe that's the most important kind of legacy anyone can leave." On a humid Thursday morning in late July, Grace was helping Mrs. Eleanor organize Mr. Whitmore's medications when the doorbell rang with the formal persistence that typically announced professional visitors. Through the front window, she could see a distinguished man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase, the kind of visitor that usually meant business rather than social calls. Mrs. Eleanor glanced toward the stairs where her husband was resting. "I'll get it," she said, smoothing her hair and straightening her dress with the automatic gestures of a woman accustomed to receiving unexpected callers with proper composure. Grace continued arranging the pill bottles by time and dosage, a system she had developed to help Mrs. Eleanor manage the increasingly complex medication schedule. She could hear voices in the front hall, Mrs. Eleanor's polite greeting, followed by a man's deeper tones, expressing condolences and requesting a private meeting. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with her usual nervous energy. "Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that was Mr. Harrison, James's attorney. He needs to speak with the family, all of the family." The emphasis on all was subtle but unmistakable. Grace felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Mrs. Eleanor, if this is family business—" "You are family business," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "James was very specific about that. He wants you present for this meeting." An hour later, Grace found herself in the formal living room, a space she had cleaned countless times, but had never sat in as anything other than a temporary occupant during household tasks. Sarah sat beside her on the burgundy sofa, while Mrs. Eleanor occupied her usual chair near the window. James Jr. had driven down from Auburn that morning, his young face serious with the weight of family responsibility. Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of a man who had conducted many such meetings. "As you know," he began, "Mr. Whitmore asked me to review and update his will several months ago after his diagnosis. He was very particular about certain provisions, and he insisted that all beneficiaries be present for the reading." Grace's breath caught. Beneficiaries. Surely there had been some mistake. "The primary provisions are straightforward," Mr. Harrison continued, reading from the legal document in his measured attorney's voice. "The house and primary assets go to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, with trust funds established for the children's education and future security." Grace began to relax. Of course, those were the primary provisions. Whatever Mr. Whitmore had wanted her to hear was probably a small bequest, perhaps enough money to ensure her security in her later years, a gesture of gratitude that would allow her to retire with dignity. "However," Mr. Harrison said, turning to a new page, "Mr. Whitmore was very specific about acknowledging someone who has been, in his words, the true heart and foundation of this family for 27 years. Grace felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "To Grace Washington," Mr. Harrison read, his voice clear and formal, "who has devoted her life to raising my children with more love and wisdom than I had the sense to show them myself, I leave the sum of $50,000, the deed to the property at 412 Magnolia Street." Grace's world tilted. 412 Magnolia Street was the main house, the Whitmore family home, and equal inheritance rights with my biological children to be considered in all future family decisions of significance. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace stared at the attorney, certain she had misunderstood something fundamental about what he had just read. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "Could you repeat that?" Mr. Harrison looked at her with gentle patience. "Mr. Whitmore has left you $50,000, the family home, and has designated you as an equal inheritor with legal standing in family matters." Mrs. Eleanor made a small sound, not distress exactly, but something like surprise mixed with recognition. Sarah reached for Grace's hand, squeezing it tightly. "There's more," Mr. Harrison continued. "Mr. Whitmore included a personal letter to be read aloud as part of the will." He cleared his throat and began to read in James Whitmore's own words. "Grace Washington came to work for my family 27 years ago, and I thought I was hiring help. I was wrong. I was inviting a woman of extraordinary character to become the foundation upon which my children's lives would be built. She has loved them through illnesses I was too busy to notice, celebrated their victories when I was too distracted to pay attention, and provided them with moral guidance when I was too proud to admit I didn't have all the answers. Grace sacrificed her own chances at motherhood to raise my children. She put aside her own dreams to ensure theirs could flourish. She gave us her best years, her deepest love, and her unwavering loyalty, asking for nothing more than the privilege of caring for people she had chosen to love as her own family. The law may not recognize her as my children's mother, but love recognizes no such limitations. Grace Washington is family in every way that matters, and it is long past time that our recognition of that truth extended beyond sentiment to include practical acknowledgement. I leave her the house because it has been her home far longer than it has been merely the place where she worked. I leave her equal standing in family decisions because her wisdom and judgment have guided this family through every important choice for nearly 3 decades. And I leave her financial security because no one has earned the right to dignity and independence more than the woman who ensured that dignity and security for all of us. Mr. Harrison set down the letter and looked around the room. There are additional provisions establishing Grace's legal rights to remain in the property regardless of any future family circumstances, and ensuring her inclusion in all matters related to the children's welfare and education. Grace felt as though she were floating outside of her own body, watching this scene unfold from somewhere near the ceiling. $50,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having. The house, the beautiful grand house where she had worked but never owned, was now legally hers. But more than the money, more than the property, was the recognition embedded in every word of James Whitmore's final testament. He had seen her, not just seen her service, but seen her heart, her sacrifice, her love. He had understood what it meant for a woman to give up her own chances at family in order to nurture someone else's children, and he had found a way to ensure that her decades of invisible labor were finally, formally acknowledged. "Grace?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Grace, are you all right?" Grace looked around the room at the faces of the family she had served and loved for so long. Mrs. Eleanor's expression showed complex emotions. Surprise, certainly, but also something that looked like relief, as if a burden she had carried, unknowingly, was finally being lifted. James Jr. was nodding slowly, as if the contents of the will made perfect sense to him. Sarah was crying, but her tears seemed to be tears of joy. "I don't understand," Grace said finally. "The house, this house, it's been in your family for generations, and now it will be in yours," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. "James told me he was making changes to his will, but he didn't tell me the details. He said he wanted to ensure that the people who had truly built this family's happiness were properly provided for." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "Grace, you've earned this. You've earned all of it." Grace felt 27 years of careful boundaries dissolving around her like morning mist. She was no longer the help who happened to be beloved. She was family who happened to have been employed. The distinction was profound, life-altering, and completely overwhelming. For the first time in her adult life, Grace Washington was not dependent on someone else's goodwill for her security. She had been given not just money and property, but recognition, dignity, and the legal standing to claim her place in the family she had devoted her life to serving. The woman who had spent decades being invisible had just been made undeniably, permanently, officially seen. The days following the will reading passed in a haze of complicated emotions and practical considerations that Grace had never imagined she would need to navigate. She found herself the legal owner of a house she had cleaned and maintained for decades, suddenly responsible for property taxes and insurance decisions that had always been someone else's concern. But more challenging than the Practical implications were the emotional adjustments required of everyone in the household. Mrs. Eleanor seemed caught between gratitude and uncertainty, struggling to redefine a relationship that had been built on clear hierarchical boundaries. The children, even grown James Jr., looked at Grace with new eyes, as if her changed legal status had revealed aspects of her they had never fully recognized. Grace herself felt unmoored, floating between her old identity as devoted employee and her new status as acknowledged family member. She continued her daily routines, preparing meals, managing household tasks, but now these activities felt different, chosen rather than assigned, expressions of love rather than obligations of employment. 3 days after the attorney's visit, she sat in what had always been her kitchen, but was now legally her kitchen, drinking coffee from her own china and trying to process the magnitude of the change. Henry appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. "Grace," he said, climbing onto her lap with the casual affection of a child who had never questioned his right to her attention. "Are you really going to be our mama now?" The question, asked with 6-year-old directness, struck Grace at the heart of her confusion. "What do you mean, sweetheart? James Jr. said that Daddy's papers make you family for real now, like official family. Does that mean you're going to be our mama instead of just Grace?" Grace smoothed his unruly hair, considering how to answer. A question that adults were struggling to understand. "I'm still Grace, honey. I'm still the same person who loves you and takes care of you. But yes, now it's official that I'm part of your family." "Good," Henry said, with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted the truth that adults were just now acknowledging. "I always knew you were my mama too. Now everyone else knows it." The simplicity of his acceptance was both comforting and heartbreaking. Henry had never needed legal documents to validate Grace's role in his life. He had always understood what the grown-ups were just learning to see. That afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor asked Grace to join her for tea in the sunroom, a ritual they had, never shared as equals, though Grace had served countless cups of tea in this very space. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured, not from illness, but from the nervous energy of someone navigating unfamiliar social territory. "Grace," she began, then paused as if reconsidering her words. "I want you to know that James's decision, the will, it doesn't change how grateful I am for everything you've done for us. If anything, it makes me realize how little I understood about the burden you've been carrying." Grace waited, sensing that Eleanor needed to work through her thoughts aloud. "I've been thinking about what it means," Eleanor continued, "that for 27 years you've been responsible for my children's daily well-being while I—" She paused, struggling with words. "While I dealt with my own struggles, depression, anxiety, whatever you want to call it. There were years when I could barely manage my own emotional needs, let alone theirs." Grace reached across the small table to touch Eleanor's hand. "You were dealing with loss, multiple losses. Grief doesn't follow schedules or conveniences. But you were steady," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. "When I couldn't be the mother they needed, you were. Not just keeping them fed and clean, but giving them emotional security, helping them understand the world, teaching them values I should have been teaching." The conversation was moving into territory they had never explored, the complex dynamics of a household where one woman bore the children while another raised them, where love and duty and circumstance created relationships that existed outside conventional categories. "Eleanor," Grace said, using her employer's first name deliberately, "I never tried to replace you as their mother. I never wanted to." "I know that. But the truth is, you could have. You had more influence over their character development than I did. You spent more time with them, understood their personalities better, knew how to guide them through difficulties." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, staring into her teacup. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. What I'm trying to say is that James's will doesn't just acknowledge what you gave to this family, it acknowledges what I failed to give. And somehow, instead of making me feel inadequate, it makes me feel grateful that someone loved my children. Enough to fill the gaps I couldn't fill myself. Grace felt a shift in her understanding of the complex woman who had shared her children, but never until now fully shared her heart. Eleanor wasn't threatened by Grace's new status. She was relieved by it. That evening, Sarah found Grace in the garden, tending to the herb plants they had started after Henry's birthday party. The sage was thriving in the summer heat, its silver green, leaves already fragrant enough to promise wonderful additions to fall cooking. "Grace," Sarah said, settling beside her on the garden bench, "I've been thinking about what Daddy's will means. Not just the money and the house, but the other part, about having equal standing in family decisions." Grace looked at the girl she had helped raise, now poised on the threshold of adulthood, her face serious with considerations that seemed too weighty for 15 years. "What about it, honey? It means you get a say in things like where I go to. A college, doesn't it? Like officially." Grace hadn't fully considered this implication of her new legal status. "I suppose it does." Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl Grace remembered, gap-toothed and eager, full of questions and boundless affection. "Good," Sarah said, "because I've been wanting to talk to someone about my plans, and you're the person who knows me best. Mama wants me to go to a finishing school, or maybe study something appropriate for ladies. But I want to study education. I want to become a teacher." Grace felt a familiar swell of pride mixed with protectiveness. "Teaching is a wonderful calling. I want to teach the way you taught us," Sarah continued. "Not just subjects, but how to think, how to be kind, how to see the worth in every person, regardless of their circumstances." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Your mama just wants what's best for you." "I know. But Grace, you've shown me what best really means. It's not about following the path that looks prettiest from the outside. It's about finding work that matters, that helps people, that makes the world a little better than you found it." As they sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the herbs and flowers Grace had tended for years, she realized that her influence on this family extended far beyond the daily care she had provided. She had shaped their values, their understanding of worth and dignity, their capacity for seeing beyond surface categories to the human heart beneath. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Grace was preparing breakfast when the doorbell rang, and through the window she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Mrs. Eleanor answered the door, and Grace could hear the conversation drifting from the front hall. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Rebecca Patterson. We met at your son's birthday party last month. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about Grace." Grace felt her stomach tighten. She had been dreading this moment, the inevitable social repercussions of her changed status in the household. "Of course, Mrs. Eleanor replied with careful politeness. "Would you like to come in?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Grace directly, if that would be appropriate." Grace dried her hands on her apron and made her way to the front hall, steeling herself for whatever criticism or concern Mrs. Patterson had come to express. "Grace," Mrs. Patterson said, extending her hand with a warm smile that completely contradicted Grace's expectations. "I'm so glad to see you. I hope you remember me, Tommy's mother from the birthday party." Grace shook her hand cautiously. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson. How can I help you?" "I wanted to follow up on our conversation that day about teaching. You see, I've spoken with my sister who works for the school district, and she's very interested in meeting with you." Grace blinked in surprise. "Meeting with me?" "The truth is, we're facing a shortage of qualified educators who truly understand children. My sister was impressed when I told her about your natural teaching ability, your way with the children. At Henry's party, She asked me to find out if you might be interested in pursuing a teaching certificate." Mrs. Eleanor stepped forward, her expression curious rather than protective. "Grace, you never mentioned wanting to teach." It was a dream I had long ago," Grace said carefully, "before I came to work here." Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "It's never too late to pursue dreams, especially when you have such natural talent. The district has programs for adult learners, ways to earn certification while working with experienced teachers. They particularly need educators who can work with children from different backgrounds, who understand that learning happens in many different ways." Grace felt a door opening in her mind, a possibility she had never dared to consider seriously. With her newfound financial security, she could afford to take time for education. With her legal standing as family rather than employee, she could make choices based on her own aspirations rather than just the Whitmore family's needs. "I'd like to think about it," Grace said carefully. "Of course, but Grace, don't think too long. The fall semester starts in 6 weeks, and if you're interested, my sister would like to meet with you as soon as possible." After Mrs. Patterson left, Grace found herself alone with Mrs. Eleanor in the front hall, both women processing the implications of the unexpected offer. "Grace," Eleanor said softly, "you should do it. You should pursue teaching. But the household, Henry, will be—" "Fine," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Grace, for 27 years, you've put our needs before your own dreams. James's will wasn't just about providing for your security. I think it was about giving you the freedom to finally live for yourself." That evening, as Grace sat in her room above the garage, her garage now, she reminded herself, she pulled out the notebook where she had been recording observations about the Whitmore children over the years. Page after page documented her informal teaching, her methods for helping them understand difficult concepts, her techniques for nurturing their individual strengths and addressing their particular challenges. Without realizing it, she had been developing a teaching philosophy for decades. She had learned that every child needed to be seen as an individual, that patience and kindness were more effective than rules and punishment, that learning happened best when children felt safe and valued. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to pursue dreams that had been deferred but never truly abandoned. As she prepared for bed that night, Grace realized that tomorrow would bring a conversation with Mr. Whitmore that she had been both anticipating and dreading. The man was growing weaker each day, and she sensed that their time for important discussions was running short. There were things that needed to be said, acknowledgments that needed to be made, forgiveness that needed to be offered and received. Tomorrow, she would sit beside the man who had just changed her entire life, and they would finally speak the truths that had been gathering between them for 27 years. The next morning, Grace climbed the stairs to Mr. Whitmore's bedroom, carrying his breakfast tray with hands that trembled slightly, not from the weight of dishes, but from the magnitude of the conversation she knew they needed to have. The will. Reading had changed everything between them, stripping away decades of careful professional distance and leaving them face to face as equals, perhaps for the first time since she had entered his employ. James was propped up against his pillows, looking frailer than she had ever seen him, but with eyes that held the clarity of someone who had made peace with his approaching mortality. He smiled when he saw her, a genuine expression of warmth that she had rarely witnessed during their years of polite employer-employee interactions. "Grace," he said, his voice thin but determined, "I was hoping you'd come to see me today. We have things to discuss, you and I." Grace set the tray on his bedside table and settled into the chair that had become as familiar to her as any piece of furniture in the house. For weeks, she had been his caregiver, managing his medications and helping him navigate the practical aspects of dying. But today felt different. Today they would speak as two people who had shared a family, who had shaped each other's lives in ways they were only beginning to acknowledge. "Mr. James," she began, but he raised a trembling hand to stop her. Just, James, he said, after 27 years and everything we've meant to each other, I think we can dispense with the formalities. Grace nodded, feeling another small barrier dissolve between them. James, I need to thank you for the will, for what you've done. You never expected to be acknowledged for what you've given us. He interrupted gently. That's part of what I need to apologize for. Grace felt her breath catch. Apologize. James struggled to sit up straighter, and Grace automatically moved to help him, adjusting his pillows with the practiced care of someone who had been managing his comfort for months. Grace, I've had a lot of time to think, lying here with nothing but my conscience for company, and I've realized that for 27 years I benefited from your love and dedication while failing to give you the recognition you deserved. He paused, gathering strength for words that seemed to have been weighing on his heart for weeks. You gave up your own chances at motherhood to raise my children. You put aside your own dreams. I remember you mentioning wanting to teach when you first came to work for us, to ensure that my family had everything we needed. You poured your heart into people who took you for granted. Grace felt tears threatening, but she remained silent, sensing that this confession had been building in him for a long time. I watched you comfort Henry through nightmares that I was too tired to handle. I saw you help Sarah with homework when I was too impatient to explain things properly. I knew you were teaching James Jr. values that I should have been instilling myself. And through it all, I told myself that you were just doing your job exceptionally well. James reached for her hand, with fingers that were thin and cold but still capable of conveying warmth. The truth is, Grace, you weren't just doing a job. You were being a mother to my children when I was too proud to admit that they needed more than I was giving them. You were holding this family together when Eleanor couldn't and I wouldn't. Grace squeezed his hand gently. James, you don't need. Do. Yes, I do, he said firmly. I need to say this and you need to hear it. You deserve to know that your sacrifices were seen even when I didn't have the courage to acknowledge them properly. He was quiet for a moment, his breathing labored with emotion and effort. When he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. The will isn't just about providing for your security, Grace. It's about giving you back some of what you gave us. The house, the money, the legal recognition, their payment for a debt I can never fully repay. Grace felt decades of unspoken truths settling between them like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. Those children saved me as much as I helped them, she said softly. After Thomas died, I was lost. This family gave me purpose, gave me people, to love when I thought that part of my life was over. But at what cost? James asked. Grace, you were 35 when you came to us. You could have remarried, had children of your own, built a life that was yours instead of borrowed from ours. Grace considered his words, thinking about the path not taken, the Samuel who had wanted to marry her, the children she might have. And if she had made different choices, I don't regret it, she said finally, and realized as she spoke that it was completely true. I don't regret loving your children, James, even if the world couldn't see it. Even if I couldn't claim them. Publicly, they were mine in every way that mattered. Henry calling for me when he had bad dreams, Sarah seeking my advice about boys, James Jr. trusting me with his fears about not being good enough. Those moments were worth everything I gave up. James's eyes filled with tears. They love you, Grace, all of them. They love you the way children love their mothers. I know, Grace said simply, and I love them the same way. In that moment, sitting beside this dying man who had just given her everything she had never dared to ask for, Grace understood that their relationship had always been more complicated than employer and employee, more intimate than their social positions would have suggested. They had been partners in raising his children, collaborators in building a family's happiness, though neither had been able to acknowledge it until now. James reached toward his bedside table with trembling fingers, struggling to open the drawer that held his most precious possessions. Grace moved to help him, and together they retrieved a small velvet box that she had dusted around, but never opened during her months of caring for him. "This was my father's," James said, his voice growing stronger with the importance of what he was about to do. "And his father's before that. It's been passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore men." He opened the box to reveal a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, its chain still gleaming despite its age. Grace could see an inscription on the back, though she couldn't make out the words from her position beside. "The bed," the inscription says, "To James Whitmore Sr. for faithful service to family 1894, James explained, his thumb tracing the engraved letters. "My great-grandfather received this when he completed 25 years as a family patriarch, not just providing for his wife and children, but truly nurturing them, guiding them, being present for their lives in ways that mattered." Grace watched as James struggled to lift the watch from its box, and she gently helped him, feeling the weight of the gold and the accumulated history it represented. "Grace," James said, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that reminded her of the businessman he had once been, "you've given 27 years of faithful service to this family, not just service, devotion, love. You've been more present for my children's lives than I was, more nurturing, more consistently available for what they needed." He placed the watch in her hands, and Grace felt the weight of 4 generations of family history settling into her palms. This watch should go to someone who has truly served this family with faithfulness and love. That someone is you. Grace stared at the watch, overwhelmed by the gesture's significance. "James, this is a family heirloom. It should go to James Jr." "It is going to family," James said firmly. "Grace, you are family. The will makes it official, but this watch makes it personal. I want you to have something that represents not just legal recognition, but emotional acknowledgement of what you've meant to us." Tears that Grace had been holding back for days finally spilled over. She looked at the watch through blurred vision, understanding that this gift represented something even more profound than the house or the money. This was James Whitmore's way of saying that she belonged not just in the family's present and future, but in its history and traditions. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll remember that you were loved," James replied. "Say you'll remember that your life mattered, not just to us, but in ways that will ripple forward through generations." Grace nodded, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. James settled back against his pillows, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of 27 years of unspoken truths finally acknowledged and resolved between them. "Grace," James said eventually, "Eleanor told me about the teaching opportunity, about Mrs. Patterson's sister and the school district." Grace looked up, surprised. "You know about that?" "I know, and I want you to pursue it." His voice carried the authority of a final request. "You have gifts that shouldn't be limited to one family, no matter how much that family loves you. You understand children in ways that could help dozens, maybe hundreds of young people over the years. But Henry, the household, will be fine." James interrupted, echoing his wife's words from the day before. "Grace, the greatest gift you can give my children now is showing them what it looks like when someone finally puts their own dreams first. Show them that love doesn't require self-sacrifice. Show them that it's possible to care for others while still honoring your own aspirations." Grace thought about Sarah's plans to study education, about the girl's desire to teach with the same patience and kindness she had witnessed in Grace. Maybe James was right. Maybe the best way to love these children was to model courage in pursuing her own calling. "I'll think about it," she said. "Think quickly," James said with a weak smile. "I may not have much time left, but I want to know that you're going to claim the life you've earned." That evening, Grace sat in her room with the pocket watch resting on her dresser beside her worn Bible. She had wound it carefully and listened to its steady ticking, the same rhythm that had marked time for James's father and grandfather. Now, marking time for her. Tomorrow, she decided, she would call Mrs. Patterson's sister. She would inquire about the teaching program, about what it would take to earn her certification, about whether a 62-year-old woman who had spent her career in service could transform her informal education skills into formal teaching. Credentials. For the first time in 27 years, Grace Washington was going to make a decision based not on what her family needed from her, but on what she wanted for herself. The pocket watch ticked steadily through the night, marking time, not just for the past, but for the future that was finally completely her own. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning when the magnolia trees were beginning their slow turn toward winter dormancy, Grace Washington sat in the sunroom that was now legally her sunroom, preparing lesson plans for her student teaching assignment at Montgomery Elementary School. The house felt different now, not just because the legal papers declared it hers, but because the relationships within its walls had fundamentally shifted. Mrs. Eleanor had moved into the smaller bedroom down the hall from where her husband had spent his final weeks, and the master bedroom now belonged to Grace. It had taken her weeks to feel comfortable sleeping in the room where she had once brought breakfast trays. But gradually, it had become home in ways she was still learning to understand. James had passed peacefully in early September, surrounded by his family. A family that officially included Grace for the first time in 27 years. She had held his hand as his breathing grew shallow, had whispered prayers and words of love that needed no formal relationship to validate their truth. When the funeral director asked about arrangements, Mrs. Eleanor had looked to Grace as naturally as she looked to her own children, acknowledging what everyone finally understood. Grace's grief was as profound and legitimate as any biological. Family members, the funeral itself had been a revelation. Grace had expected to sit in the back, to maintain the respectful distance that had always marked her public appearances with the family. Instead, she found herself in the front pew, flanked by Henry on one side and Sarah on the other, acknowledged as family not just by the Whitmores, but by the entire community that had known her as the help for nearly 3 decades. Now, as she reviewed her notes for the day's mathematics lesson, she was working with 3rd graders who were struggling. With basic addition and subtraction, Grace marveled at how completely her life had transformed. At 62, she was a student again, learning about child development and educational psychology, discovering that her instinctive teaching methods aligned with the most current pedagogical theories. Her supervising teacher, a young woman named Miss Roberts, who was barely older than Sarah, had expressed amazement at Grace's natural classroom management skills and her intuitive understanding of how different children learned best. "Mrs. Washington," she had said just last week, "you have 27 years of unofficial teaching experience. The children respond to you in ways that take most of us years to develop." Grace had smiled at the Mrs. Washington, a title of respect that felt both foreign and deeply satisfying after decades of being called simply Grace by employers and Miss Grace by their children. The sound of Henry's laughter drifted in from the garden, where he was playing with the new puppy that Mrs. Eleanor had finally agreed to adopt, a golden retriever named Scout, who had quickly become the center of the 8-year-old's universe. Grace looked up from her lesson plans to watch through the window as Henry threw a tennis ball with the kind of unbridled joy that seemed to radiate from him constantly. The boy had adjusted to his father's death with the resilience that children possess, but Grace knew he still had moments of sadness that required careful attention. Just last night, he had appeared at her bedroom door, with tears in his eyes, missing his daddy and needing the comfort that only Grace seemed able to provide. Sarah appeared in the sunroom doorway, beautiful in her Montgomery Academy uniform, her blonde hair pinned back in preparation for the school day. "Morning, Grace," she said, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of someone who had never questioned Grace's belonging in this space. "How are the lesson plans coming?" "Slowly," Grace admitted. "I'm teaching fractions next week, and I'm trying to figure out how to make them interesting for 8-year-olds. Sarah grinned. "Remember when you taught me fractions using pie ingredients? You had me measuring out half cups and quarter cups of flour until I understood that fractions were just pieces of a whole." Grace smiled at the memory. "That might actually and work, cooking fractions. Everything's better when it involves food," Sarah said, then grew more serious. "Grace, I wanted to talk to you about something." Grace set down her pen, giving Sarah her full attention. "I've been accepted to Auburn for next fall," Sarah said, "to study education like we talked about. But I've also been thinking about what you said, about there being different ways to help children, different ways to teach." Grace waited, sensing that Sarah was working toward something important. "I want to specialize in working with children from different backgrounds. Children who might not fit into traditional classroom settings, or who come from families that have been overlooked by the educational system." Grace felt a familiar swell of pride in this young woman who had grown up watching her navigate between worlds, who had learned that love and learning could transcend social boundaries. "That sounds wonderful, Sarah. Challenging but wonderful." "I want to teach the way you taught us," Sarah said, "with patience and creativity and the understanding that every child has something valuable to offer, regardless of their circumstances." As Sarah left for school and Grace gathered her materials for her own day at Montgomery Elementary, she reflected on the profound ways that love had rippled through this family, creating changes that would extend far beyond her own lifetime. Henry was growing up with an understanding of dignity and worth that would shape how he treated everyone he encountered. Sarah was choosing a career path that would allow her to extend Grace's teaching philosophy to children who needed advocates. Even James Jr., now in his final year at Auburn, had changed his major to social work, inspired by what he called Grace's example of caring for people who couldn't necessarily care for themselves in return. Mrs. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen. As Grace prepared to leave, holding a thermos of coffee and a brown bag lunch, with the kind of maternal care that Grace had provided for the family for decades. "For your day," Eleanor said simply, but her gesture spoke to the ways their relationship had evolved into something resembling genuine friendship between equals. As Grace drove to school in the car that was now legally hers, a modest sedan purchased with money from her inheritance, she passed the house on Cypress Street where she had lived before coming to work for the Whitmores. It looked smaller than she remembered, but it held no regrets for her. Every choice she had made, every sacrifice and every joy had led to this moment. Grace Washington, student teacher, homeowner, officially acknowledged family member, finally living a life that was entirely her own while remaining connected to the people she had chosen to love. At 62, she was just beginning.